Good morning. We made it to Friday, March 28th. It's another week beyond the last time we were together, and things have changed. In fact, Congress seems to want to keep me on my toes because every week I have to revise my slides the day before the presentation because they've made another decision. So we'll get through what's happening and some action steps that we can take in the next couple of weeks. First of all, I want everyone to do a little victory lap. It could be a small circle, it could be a large circle. You decide on the size of the circle, but you have kept Medicaid in the news this week, and there are a number of really nice, lengthy, well-done pieces that have been published across the state featuring people with disabilities and their family members. And I think it's a great credit to all of you that those are the stories that really are the most prominently covered by the media. You are doing above and beyond and really making this issue very, very real for a much wider audience. So I know you've been working really hard. It's paying off and it's starting to get noticed. And there are more and more folks like yourself who can kind of add on to that work. So this is a graph that we've seen before. It's kind of a working timeline. And we'll get into a little bit of what's changed this week. I think that the best way to think about this period is, first of all, there's a lot of disagreement. Congress knows it's being watched. The US Senate and the US House are different bodies, and they are both looking for leverage against each other, and they both want the other side to telegraph their cuts first. So we're going to go into how we are in a period which is a slow game of chicken, essentially. Here's where we are. There has been nothing is decided, and a lot of, there's a big variety of opinion, not only between the US House and Senate, but among the US senators and House members about what to do. That includes how deep should Medicaid cuts be. There are people worried that their constituents are really watching what they're doing, and they're worried that that might mean they could lose their job if they do too much. So those are the swing seat lawmakers. They have an interest in wanting to see the cuts be less steep. But there's also in both the House and Senate some very determined fiscal conservatives who don't think the cuts are going far enough. And to try and come up with a bill that keeps both of those extremes happy is difficult. So they're trying some ideas about, well, maybe we can just change the accounting practices to make it look like the cuts are, that the tax cuts don't cost anything. And they're trying to see if the parliamentarian, who's the guy who decides what the rules really are, will let them do that. At the same time, they've got this big package of, a known, here's the 2017 taxes that we think we want to continue at this level. And that the president has added more ideas. And some of those ideas are ideas that will reduce the amount of money coming into the government, which means that you have overall a smaller budget to begin with. So we have a desire to extend 2017 tax cuts, and then more ideas that would need to be offset. If you're reducing revenue, then there would definitely be people who would say, well, if we're getting less money in, then we should also spend less. I'll just point out that no one is asking the question, are people willing to pay the same amount of taxes as they did in 2017? Because if they were, then we wouldn't have to have any of this conversation. But that has not been the frame since January. The frame has been, how do we keep paying the tax rate that we are now, as opposed to going back to what we would have paid in 2017. So when we talked with our national folks who are having meetings with US senators and representatives across the country, they are all being told different things, which tells us that there really isn't, no, there haven't been any decisions made. But they're also picking up on lawmakers aren't necessarily advocating behind the scenes with their colleagues for anything specific. In fact, many of them are saying, well, we're waiting to be told what leaders decide, which is interesting because I think that's a question constituents can ask. What are you doing behind the scenes? How are you elevating our voices to your colleagues and you know, making a case for something in particular? This week, there was a behind the closed doors meeting that members had, and the topic was exclusively on Medicaid cuts. So we know that this is the big issue that is really driving an unresolved to the whole process. And of course, Medicaid is the place where they're looking to make the deepest cuts. So it makes sense that, you know, if you don't have agreement on the place where you are expecting you will get the most funding for your proposals, you're not going to move very far very fast. So we're in the slow game of chicken. Here's what we know as of the 26th, which was 2 days ago. We remember that the House passed its budget resolution February 25th, and that resolution sets the level of cuts they're looking to do, $2 trillion, and assigns cuts to various committees, and they assigned at least $880 billion in cuts to the committee that oversees Medicaid. That is what the House did. The Senate, that Speaker Johnson has been wanting the Senate to just agree with the proposal that the House passed, but the Senate doesn't want to do that. And they, part of why they don't want to do that is because they're not confident the House can actually get to the level of cuts that it passed. And they don't want to agree to do the same thing unless they know that the House will agree to the same thing. So the Senate is rewriting its budget resolution, and it's going to pass its own blueprint. And it's the same sort of document. It's just on the Senate side, right? The House passed theirs, and the Senate says, we're not agreeing to what the House did. We're going to do our own thing. And we are going to set the total level of cuts that we're going to say is what we're willing to do. And then we're going to assign levels of cuts to various committees. Okay. You should expect that the Senate blueprint will have lower numbers. Don't get comfortable with that, okay? The Senate now that the House has passed their big numbers, the Senate is in a comfortable position to propose something different and less and look more reasonable. That doesn't mean they will end up being more reasonable because both the House and the Senate have to pass the exact same language. And now that we're going to be having two very different proposals, that those differences give both the House and the Senate leverage over each other. In other words, if the House makes a bunch of cuts and the Senate proposes a bunch of cuts, first of all, they can look between the two and say which ones are the same. Woohoo, agreement. And then they can look at which cuts are different and merge them together. And so you could end up with two proposals that have very different cuts in them and end up merging them together and end up with more cuts. You know, they could add together the cuts that they want to do. The other thing that's happening in the slow game of chicken is by the Senate passing its own resolution, it buys itself a little time. Remember, the House has been in the same position since February 25th. And the committee that oversees Medicaid, which is the Energy and Commerce Committee, has been waiting to see what the Senate does. It doesn't want to telegraph what cuts it plans to make, and it would prefer to have the Senate agree to that level of cuts and agree, and say what they want to do first. But the Senate isn't going to let them do that. So now the House is in the same position it's been in, and the committees have to do something. Meanwhile, the Senate hasn't passed its blueprint yet, and it hasn't assigned the cuts to its committees. So in process, it's a little farther behind, which buys it more time, and it forces the House to have to go first. Then, once the House committee has kind of laid their what cuts that they're proposing on the table, it allows the Senate to see what they are, first of all, and how people react to them. People meaning constituents like yourselves. I already mentioned this, but the additional ideas that the president wants, which impact revenue, weren't part of the House resolution. So that $2 trillion in spending cuts doesn't account for those new ideas. So it's unclear, but it seems like if they are trying to add more things in that have an impact and bringing less money into the country, into the budget that you're spending, that it might be more likely that there's going to be more change. The other thing that is being used is leverage. You can kind of see, like, you think about it as like levers and pulleys, right? And you've got the Senate and the House both kind of trying to wait out and see what each other's doing and put some pressure on each other and use some crises points, to kind of put the pressure on to do things. The debt ceiling is the next crisis point, and we now have better information about when that crisis will occur, which does put some parameters about when you need to have a reconciliation bill agreed upon by both houses and passed. So the debt ceiling, our country has to pay the amount it owes. And we have made spending decisions in the past and taken out loans, and we have to pay those loans. So the debt ceiling is that point in time where we have to say, yes, we're going to continue to pay our debts. And it's been used in the past by Congress as a way to kind of go right up to the edge and then get a whole bunch of things done, because if you don't pass the debt ceiling, then your country defaults, and that's a bad thing. So the Congressional Budget Office has a new estimate that says that clock is ticking, and we think that it will get to the point where we will default on our debts unless Congress does something by August or September. That time frame, August or September, now becomes the deadline for the reconciliation bill, because there are members of Congress who want to be able to do everything without relying on the Democrats for anything. Remember, the Republican Party controls both the US Senate and House. So they would prefer to pass legislation with only Republican votes and not have to rely on Democrats, because Democrats might have a very different point of view. And if you need to negotiate with Democrats, your bill would probably look a little bit different, maybe quite a bit different. So there is some pressure to try and get everything done all at once, and wrap in, raising the debt ceiling into this big reconciliation bill, which puts a lot more pressure on all of the members of the House and the Senate to pass that bill, because the stakes are higher if it doesn't pass. So you can, again, it's all about leverage and figuring out how you make a package of cuts and legislation that can't be refused, right? Now, the debt ceiling could be reached earlier. depending on, how much money comes in. We are making estimates about how much tax revenue and other revenues are coming into the government. And a lot of times we're correct on that, but sometimes there's, we get more or less money than expected. So this is kind of a fluid timeline. Most people seem to think the estimate of August or September is about the right timeline. And that kind of puts for us a window of, okay, when would we expect that this process would have to be at some sort of conclusion? So there's good news, but there's some caution. Again, disagreement, it buys delay and it buys a lot more time. And you have been using that time really, really effectively. Every week, every day, Medicaid continues to be in the news. And that's a really big deal. We want to keep it in the news because we don't want Congress to forget that there are real people that would be impacted by those cuts if they are thinking about doing them. Now, the caution is that any cuts that both the House and the Senate agree to that end up in legislation, it makes it harder to undo those. Not impossible. So there's a lot of movement right now to get as much done behind the scenes before anybody knows what's in the package. That makes it much easier for legislation to move quickly. It makes it a lot harder for people to know what's in the bill and what it means before it's kind of moving down the road. And it makes it harder to, but not impossible, to undo cuts that both chambers have decided that they agree with. Right now, lawmakers have, they have time right now, but there is also an incentive to move fast, to pass cuts and shift those decisions to states. Okay, so little smattering of coverage from across the state, Madison, La Crosse, Northeast Wisconsin, pretty much all of the major media markets this week had at least one or two or more stories about Medicaid. Some folks actually designed their own events. Some people were attending an event that was put on by a member of Congress. You see Senator Baldwin there. She did a whole tour last week across the state on Medicaid. And some people were still attending town halls and talking about Medicaid. Most of the coverage on town halls that are happening, there is somebody talking about Medicaid at those places. So this is all really great work. And I want to spotlight in Congressional District 8, they actually they planned and they held their own event, which is something that people in your congressional district might do too. And I just want to highlight that, they had this idea of like a community conversation about Medicaid, which is a great idea. I think a lot of lawmakers are now starting to feel kind of nervous about attending town halls, but some of them actually do want to learn about the issues, but they're worried about like lots of people coming and yelling at them. And I guess, I don't like to be yelled at. So, showing up to a place where you feel like that's going to happen is maybe not what I would choose to do on my own time. So their idea was to have a kind of contained event with a panel of people who could talk about different aspects of Medicaid. So they had, a person who, provided Medicaid, a business that provides services to people on Medicaid. They had a parent and a family member who was representing how they use Medicaid. And they had, some professionals who have kind of a bigger picture of, here's who's coming through our doors looking for help and what their options are. So it was like a nice educational event, but had a clear perspective. But the thing is, when you're doing an event, you get a lot out of it. It isn't only the event itself. And I kind of put this on a thing here. They sent out a media advisory to a whole bunch of people. Bam, it's Medicaid. They sent out a reminder to the same group of people. That's the second time that group of media heard about Medicaid. They had the event. There was a media person who showed up to cover it. They recorded their own event. So no matter what, they had a recording of their event that they could share, even if no media showed up, which they did. And the media that showed up did do a story about it. So now you have two things to share. And for the amount of work that it came, that they put into the event, I don't want to say it wasn't any work, but they got at least 6 touch points on Medicaid out of that one event and things to share and go beyond the event. So it's worthwhile to think about, how do you create those opportunities for conversation and then really maximize the amount of talking space that you get about the issue. At that event, they did some materials for it that I thought would be useful to all of us. And, we've been talking over the weeks a lot about Medicaid being labeled as fraud, waste, and abuse. That's kind of a recurring theme that a narrative, so to speak, that is easy to say, but doesn't have a lot of factual basis. And they thought about how to talk about Medicaid that in a positive way. So they flipped the script and talked about Medicaid not being fraud, waste, and abuse, but being efficient, accountable, and impactful. And actually had a nice little PDF of these points on there. Just kind of doing some translation of things that are true. Medicaid is cost effective. It does save taxpayer dollars. The state sets the price and controls it. We know that our institution diversion programs are extremely cost effective because Family Care Iris and CLTS are keeping people out of much more expensive institutional settings. We know that there are a lot of rules about Medicaid, a lot of oversight and audits. So, that is a way that fraud is prevented. And we know that Medicaid is the reason why a lot of people are having very full, rich lives that include, working and staying out of hospitals and being as independent as possible. So it's kind of a nice way to think about, how do you take something that has a negative, meaning to it and turn it around to talk about it from a positive direction. Same sheet, and I just copied it. Here are some of the things that Medicaid does. Again, talking about Medicaid in terms of a proactive program. It saves money. It prevents costly crises. It ensures strong oversight. It supports the workforce, not only paying workers who are delivering the health and long-term care, but it keeps unpaid workers in the workforce, and it's supporting the health care for most of the people in Medicaid, most of whom are working. So you've kind of got 3 different pieces of the workforce that are supported by Medicaid, and then supporting local economies. So you can feel free to use this kind of language when you're talking to lawmakers or other people in your life. I think some of these items aren't necessarily things that people think about when they hear the word Medicaid, but they are all true. There have been a couple of nice opinion and other articles that have come out this week, and this one was particularly impactful. And again, it's really designed to be towards a wider audience who maybe isn't in Medicaid yet, but doesn't realize that they may rely on it in the future. So this piece is a great piece to share and help people understand that, at some point, at any point in time, you may need to rely on Medicaid for lots of different reasons, and that there is it is a financial safety net for families as well. A good piece, lots of people shared it. Here is what one person online, kind of they shared the article, and then this was their caption, and it happened to be a person who, is very familiar with Medicaid as a family member of who has a child that has an intellectual and developmental disability. I thought this is just a nice plain language way of, adding some of your personal experience to an article that's really geared to convince a wider group of people why Medicaid is important to them, even if they're not on it right now. I'm giving you homework for the first time in 7 weeks. This is just such a great article. Local people again, and I want, read through it and then, think about, the people in your life who have very similar stories. It's just such a wonderful way of talking about how Medicaid has created a full, rich life for this whole family, and what it does, what supports it's provided. It also had the perspective of, a business provider in the article who works with this young man. And it has the perspective of, not only the family talking about Medicaid and how it has helped their family, but also all of the other families they know who have different situations who are in Medicaid. So it's a really great example of how somebody is using their own experience and drawing in other people who share their experience, supporting their family, and also making the case that it's not only their family, that it is many other people that they personally know. So it's a really good article that I just encourage everybody to read and think about how you might tell that story for people in your circle that you know. Maybe there's a reporter who has who needs something to do, and you can provide that for them. A couple other opinion pieces. This is from a person, again, another parent who's talking about the impact of Medicaid. And in this case, not only does it impact and support his son, but both he and his wife are people who work for a Medicaid funded company or program. So it really does a great job of kind of talking about the breadth of how Medicaid has not only helped their family, but is, they're working for the program that is helping. So if you haven't put together a 300-word, and this was a very generous opinion piece, it's actually pretty long. So it just goes to show you that sometimes they do print things that are beyond 300 words. If you haven't done an opinion piece in a while, that's another thing that you can add to your list of action items. Professionals, this section's for you. I think it's important to know that, I talked about both of those articles that we just covered really do a good job of including the experience of people who work directly with families and people with disabilities who are in Medicaid programs. It really adds to the richness of those stories. And it's to the family's credit to kind of recognize those businesses. But businesses can also talk in their own voices. And individuals who work for businesses really can do their own contacting of their lawmakers. Everybody, including a professional, is represented by elected lawmakers. And it isn't lobbying when you're a constituent who is elevating a concern to the people who represent you. Saying where you work, talking about the clients that you serve, not necessarily revealing identity, but you can do a lot to say, here's what I see, here are the patterns, here are the themes based on many people that I work with. That your professional experience isn't lobbying, it's establishing credibility. And educating lawmakers, having a position on a policy issue, asking your lawmaker to do things as a constituent, that isn't lobbying for an organization. That is acting as an individual who is a constituent of that district. So I think that lots of times people get worried about, well, if I say anything, am I going to get in trouble, or will it cause a problem for the organization? Unless you're lobbying specifically for the organization, it isn't lobbying, it's educating lawmakers. And telling your own story, which is rooted in experience, is so important right now. And I think that many individual people with disabilities and their family members have been well represented in the media. There are some providers and businesses that have done a really great job, especially some of our home and community-based service providers, representing not only the work that they do, but the people that they serve and their families. But it's really time for more folks to start doing that, especially since we kind of have to ramp up the focus on why Medicaid cuts are not a great idea in this period before Congress has made any decisions about what those cuts actually are. Sometimes I like to do kind of silly ideas that are visual. So, but if you are a business, I think that there's some usefulness to create something that's visual, right? To say, okay, how many people, like how does Medicaid actually touch? I got hands on here. The people that you know in your lives. How many people are you serving? Get a hand from each one of them. How many workers are you paying with Medicaid dollars? How many family members of people you serve rely on your services to support their whole family, right? And I think that it doesn't take very long before even a relatively small business has some pretty big handprints, right? And it could be a really impactful way if you were going to meet with, a member of Congress, or, going to see your state lawmaker, to have those kind of stacks of hands and know how many folks you are touching. It helps expand the impression of what Medicaid dollars actually do and how far they spread out into the community. Here's an example, again, of a professional. This was an opinion piece, and it was in a national magazine that focuses on Congress, so probably not something that everybody receives. But this is from the healthcare side of things, and I think a very good way, again, of representing experience and what the impact of cuts are going to be. Again, in this case, the article was much like the example that was about Medicaid being a middle class benefit. This is also saying, hey, cutting Medicaid doesn't only impact the people who are in Medicaid, it impacts everybody else too, because it's such an essential part of how we are funding, the whole health and long-term care system. So we've talked a little bit about, some of the things that we're hearing back from lawmakers, and we've talked a little bit about sharing your own experience, but I think there is a way to do that even a little more deeply, and think of yourself as your own case study. We have a lot more lawmakers who, really are interested in the financial side of things. So if you are a business that is funded by Medicaid, it might be time to do some calculations of, maybe we don't have statewide data that is going to be easy to get to answer some of these questions. We did the best we could with, how much money is going into certain counties, how many people in those counties are on Medicaid, and how many, businesses are paid by Medicaid. We have a kind of big picture fact sheet that does that, but sometimes it's more impactful to actually do the same thing for what you do know about, which could be your own business, right? And I think it's time to do that because you don't want to wait for data that never can be generated or comes at a big enough scale when you can create your own data footprint and talk about what you know and then help the lawmakers scale up. And I think that can be a really effective strategy of, kind of doing your own little calculation. How much of your operating budget is Medicaid? How much of those dollars are paying employee salaries? How much are those employees paying into Social Security? How much of that is reportable income? Those are all things that are probably within the sphere of knowing for your business. And I bet if you did those things, you would find that Medicaid actually has a pretty big economic impact. And then what all you need to do is say, this is my one example, but we replicate that by the thousands across the state. And lawmakers get that. Like they love that in that example and then let their mind wander to understand that that's the experience of many individuals and families. Same thing. You can you think about how to calculate, different aspects of what Medicaid actually means. If lawmakers are really interested in how do those dollars translate into buying power in their communities or income tax revenue, or is this the difference between somebody being in the workforce or not, or being financially stable or not, like that's an important story to share. It's maybe a different story than what does Medicaid do specifically to meet the needs of the individual person, but it's still an important aspect of what Medicaid is. It is a way that people are stable. And it impacts oftentimes well beyond the individual person who is receiving the services. Another way to think about a case study, this is a different topic, but same idea. We've been hearing a lot about fraud, waste, and abuse, and we've gone through a lot of the reasons why we don't think that that's actually a ginormous issue in Medicaid. But there's a way for you as a small business or you as an individual to kind of tell that story differently instead of relying on national statistics or other things that can be tuned out. You can talk about it from real experience. Like how many payments or how many reimbursement requests, if you're at a business, do you do? Like what's the total volume of reimbursements that you submit in a month? And how many of them are just fine? How many had a small mistake that had to be corrected? And what was that mistake? Because I think one of the things that lawmakers are confusing is they assume that anything labeled an improper payment is fraud. We know that not to be true. We know that there's lots of little tiny mistakes on forms that happen all the time because we're humans, and that a lot of those mistakes are corrected. But you as a business owner are probably in a better position to talk about exactly what that is in a way that is real. Same thing with individuals and families. Like, how do you prove you're eligible? What do you have to do to prove that you are who you say you are and that you are qualified to be in Medicaid? If you're hiring your own workers, like as an IRIS participant, you've probably come into the same paperwork mistakes that have resulted in delays in payment or things that need to be corrected after the fact as a small business. So these are ways that you could talk about Medicaid in a different way in terms of that effective and accountability piece, to illustrate that, yeah, the mistakes aren't that many, and when they are, they're minor, and we also fix them. And that's not fun. This week, a group of 22 disability, aging, and human services professionals, we created a fact sheet specifically about the impact Medicaid cuts could have on unpaid caregivers. We certainly know that our institution diversion programs, Family Care Iris and CLTS, really rely on the consistent help from unpaid caregivers to make those care plans work. And we've also known for many years there aren't enough paid caregivers sometimes to fill the hours that are authorized in those care plans, which often means that unpaid caregivers are filling in those gaps. So we took some of the survey work that we've done, statewide survey work in the last few years, as well as some national work and statistics, and put together a fact sheet. We know right now how hard it is, and that we have a lot of unpaid caregivers who are either reducing hours or not taking promotions or leaving the workforce entirely because they just can't do the care pieces that need to be done, as well as fully participate in the workforce. And we know that a lot of them are leaving the workforce because of a lack of paid caregivers, many of whom are paid for by Medicaid. So this fact sheet really talks about, like, if that becomes a worse problem, if you have Medicaid cuts, that one of the impacts that you should expect is that when people get less help, or there's less help to be gotten, or they have to wait for services more than they already do now, the pressure to leave the workforce and take all of that experience and that, workforce capacity with them becomes much higher than it already is. So this fact sheet, use it with everyone. We are in the process of kind of cutting it apart into social media memes, and it's significant. What does it mean when somebody has to leave the workforce to provide full-time care uncompensated? It has a lot of really important financial consequences to that individual. And we actually, that example on the bottom, again, we talked about a case study. This is an example that we got from the Respite Care Association of Wisconsin. They've kind of done some thought work on, what does it mean if you have a person with the average salary in Wisconsin and they have to leave the workforce for 10 years to care for somebody? What's that mean in lost income? What's that mean in you're not contributing to Social Security? What does it mean, when you have to reduce your income, but also you have additional expenses? So it's again, a very good way of thinking through, and you might think about this in your own family. What does it mean when you have to think about whether or not you can continue to participate in the workforce as much as you are doing now? We're not the only ones saying this. That was a Wisconsin fact sheet, but this week, coincidentally, there was a national report that came out on how important Medicaid is in supporting family caregivers, which, it's always nice to have a national person support what we already know in this state with our lived experience. So what can we do the next week? Next week, the first of 4 state budget hearings are coming up. And it's an important opportunity because the cuts that are being proposed at the federal level really are so large that they will impact, the state budget. We get about $9 billion of federal Medicaid money in. Medicaid is about 25% of the entire state budget. So you start reducing the amount of federal Medicaid dollars that come into the state, and you end up with some pretty significant budget holes fairly quickly. State lawmakers really do need to pay attention to what is going on at the federal level. And they also will be the people who, if cuts happen, get handed the bag of bad decisions to make. So these are some important opportunities, and you can see if you're anywhere close to those 4 locations. The first one's in Kaukauna, the second one's in West Allis, then they go to Hayward and Wausau at the end of the month. The Kaukauna and West Allis ones are next week. You can see that there's, it's an important opportunity again to kind of come together and talk about what this means in your area, what Medicaid means to your area. You got to go early. It is a very uniquely Wisconsin experience. I don't think there's another state in the country where absolutely anybody in the state can get up and talk to the 16 members of the budget writing committee and have 3 minutes to say their thoughts on the budget, on the state budget. So it's kind of a very uniquely, festive and diverse experience. You'll have people, ordinary people coming in, taking their day off to talk about agriculture issues and school issues and, county stuff, all sorts of things. But it's important because the media covers it and they're really listening to what are the themes, what are people talking about at these hearings as being important in the budget. Couple new fact sheets again about why states should be paying attention to Medicaid cuts specifically. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on here, but you'll get the, after notes, and I'll have a link directly to these things. It does tell us that the scale of cuts proposed is pretty significant. And there's not a way that states are going to kind of get off with nibbles around the edges if these things go through. In fact, there's a couple of things that came out this week. This one, is a projection and it's based on, some assumptions, but still the thing to take away from it is this is a big deal. Like even doing, some really kind of back of the napkin math, that's a lot of people and a lot of jobs and a lot of money that is potentially impacted by an $880 billion cut. The other reason that state legislators need to hear from you about Medicaid is a lot of them are new and they may not know a lot about Medicaid. They, the joint finance members who are at these hearings are usually more experienced and they're savvier than many, but they don't always realize all the places in the state budget where Medicaid dollars are actually, the funding source too. So it's an important educational opportunity, and they do like to hear about, well, what do these things do for people? Again, same message. Here's what my life looks like now. Medicaid makes it possible, and I can't afford any less help. That's a solid message because it means don't cut this. We really need it. Even if federal cuts we're successful at the federal level, it's still a good message to tell state lawmakers that these programs are really important, that they work for you, and that you need more help, not less. The other reason to talk about Medicaid is, the state budget is a 2-year budget plan, and usually costs go up. So oftentimes in the state budget, they'll be thinking about, okay, here are all the things we spend money on, but we may need to spend more money on those things because the cost of doing them has gone up in the last 2 years. And that is certainly true of Medicaid. We have our own version of the Congressional Budget Office. We have a legislative fiscal bureau who tries to project and make calculations on what we think the state will need to spend in certain programs based on enrollment and other factors. So they're kind of the number crunching folks who are trying to help the legislature predict how much money do you need to put in certain items to keep doing things as you're doing them now. And the cost to continue all of the Medicaid programs is more than it was the last state budget because the cost of health and long-term care has gone up. So the other reason to talk to the state legislature about Medicaid is the state legislature needs to agree to spend more in this budget to keep Medicaid the same as it is now. That's completely independent of what happens with federal Medicaid, with whether Medicaid is cut at the federal level. These are two separate things, but the issue of how important Medicaid is and what it does is the same. So if you're going to attend a budget hearing, go early. You'll get there maybe at 7 in the morning. The hearing starts at 10. It goes from 10 to 5. You get in line, and then you're going to get a registration slip, whether you'll fill out your name and some other information, and then you hand that slip in, and they put all the slips in order. And it's a first come, first serve opportunity. So that's why people get there early. Because if you get there when the hearing starts, there've already been a whole bunch of other people before you in line, and they're going to get to speak, first. Sometimes people who have special accommodation needs can ask to be kind of arranged and moved so that they can be heard for, earlier. But that isn't always the case. So you get in line, you register to speak. We encourage groups of people to go. Make it a fun day. Make it, something that you're going to enjoy doing and to support each other. The other thing, while you're there, a lot of legislators and a lot of their staffers, maybe legislators that aren't on the finance committee, but represent the larger area. So like the first hearing is in Kaukauna. A lot of legislators from the surrounding area will come to the hearing just because it's near them, and they want to hear what people have to say. So there may be local media and area legislators there, and take an opportunity. You're waiting there anyway. Don't be shy. Introduce yourself. Say what you're there to talk about. Take every opportunity to educate whomever's there. You'll wait a long time. Everybody gets 3 minutes to speak. So as soon as the name's called, they go up there and they have 3 minutes, which is about 300 words. My recommendation is don't bother wasting time thanking the committee for being there because they're supposed to be. So, you just kind of get right into it, but you're experts now. You've told your story a lot of times, and you can edit yourself down and say things really powerfully within a few sentences. So that 3 minutes is important. Each individual can have 3 minutes. If you have a group that comes, oftentimes they will allow like a group of 3 or 4 people to come, and maybe you get 5 minutes as a group. So that's another option. And it's an important way to, again, elevate who is talking about these issues in a very public way. If you can't attend a hearing, 3 things to do. Yes, there is a public comment form that you can use. So type out your comment, submit it on that form, and then make sure you email your same comment to your state legislator and state representative. You want to make sure that the people who represent you know what you are saying to the Joint Finance Committee, because your state legislators, even if they're not on the committee, we have the opportunity to talk to the budget committee about what they're hearing from constituents, and all of them will have to vote on the state budget at some point anyway. The Joint Finance Committee does the major editing, but then both the Senate and the Assembly have to pass the same version of the budget bill before it goes to the governor. So every elected official does get to vote on the budget. The other thing we're telling people to do is, you've got your 300-word story, you've emailed it, you've submitted it on a form. Now record it on your phone, and post it. Post it up on, YouTube or TikTok or other social media, and tag it. Again, it's a nice way to kind of give a big boost and see that there are lots of people who are talking about Medicaid in a very real and tangible way, and add to the community conversation about Medicaid. So, okay, you can't attend a hearing. There's 4 touch points on Medicaid that you could do anyway: submitting the form, emailing your state and state senator and representative, and making a recording and posting it. So actually 5 impressions. We have heard from some state lawmakers that they do want to learn more about Medicaid, but they are a little bit nervous about doing public events. So it might be a good idea to, if you're a business, maybe you set up like a tour, or maybe you invite your legislator to your home if you're an individual, or you ask for, hey, can we coordinate a real small team meeting, private, invite only, not a town hall or anything, to talk about this topic and kind of hand pick the people who will attend that meeting and prepare them to, share a story about Medicaid that is pretty diverse, but also complementary. You can talk to your lawmaker if you're in a place where your congressman hasn't been very responsive, or maybe the responses you've gotten aren't very encouraging or factual. That's something you can bring up with your state lawmakers. Many of your state lawmakers are in rooms behind the scenes that constituents aren't in. They know members of Congress, they know other folks that are elected officials, and you can ask them to say, hey, when you're at a fundraiser or a chicken dinner, or you're taking the congressman around the district, can you elevate our stories? Can you help us make sure that they understand what Medicaid means to us? Can you help them understand what Medicaid cuts would mean to the district? And you can say, hey, maybe your ask to the congressman should be that you don't want to have to make the cuts at the local level. So don't make cuts at the federal level that then mean the states have to have a huge budget problem. It's also important to keep calling Congress. I know you've been calling them. They know you've been calling them. They probably want you to call less, but you should call more. Even if they're not responsive, even if you know that they are supportive of some Medicaid cuts, even if you know that they are not supportive of Medicaid cuts, it's important to keep those calls coming, because offices track the number of calls they're getting and what they're getting called about. And some members have been very good about publicly saying, this is how many calls I'm getting a week on this, to kind of elevate their experience and tell folks more publicly, the wider group of people more publicly, that this is an issue they're hearing a lot about from many, many different people who live in their districts. And specifically, Tammy Baldwin and Gwen Moore have been very, very public about noting how many people they're getting, how many calls they're getting a week, and what people are saying, and using those stories. And that is why some of the coverage that you saw, Senator Baldwin chose to do a whole series of events about Medicaid when she was home last time in the district. And most of the people that were, at those events that she was elevating their stories were people like you, because you were the ones who were calling. So she knew about you. And that's what you want. You want to make sure that, they have the data they need to be able to keep talking publicly about Medicaid. So, gotta keep focused. Could go fast, could go slow. At this point, you're prepared to respond. We'll keep giving you new ways to respond, new materials, new ideas to try. Some of them will be things that you'll go, yeah, I can do that. Some of them are like, maybe I'll do something else. But you're prepared now, and you're prepared to inform others. So we're in this for the long game. Remember that it's important to keep talking about it, because even though you're repeating it for the 100th time, for somebody it's their first time. And we can see how hard it is now that all of us are in different media silos to kind of break down the barriers between them. So everything that you do ends up adding to the overall voice on this issue, and that is all important. In terms of making sure that Medicaid is always top of mind. For folks who are looking for people to connect with in your congressional district, I'm going to put up, these are Facebook groups, they're local disability grassroots advocates who you can connect with, and some of them are doing great work and trying to plan different events, or they're planning to attend things, or they're planning educational events. It's a good way to get connected and to draw other people in. So make sure if you haven't, asked to join one of these groups that you think about doing that. And I am going to stop and take questions.
I don't think there were any questions that didn't get answered. I guess we can give people a chance to put any final questions in the chat.